Hi, I'm Russell. I'm a dungeon master. I've been DMing for 33 years. I'm an actor, a writer, a director. I've produced mostly short films. I've acted in a few other things, TV shows and stuff. I did some work in Hollywood. Um, we would. Now I'm back in New Zealand after the recent COVID-19 crisis, and I'm taking off as a professional dungeon master. That's my objective, I guess. And the reason for that is, on the one hand, I need money, and on the other hand, there's a demand for this. And I believe that I'm actually good enough to do that. So, when I say that, I mean I've got the skills and the experience. I'm not saying I'm special, but um, it takes a certain amount of skill and a certain amount of experience to be a half decent dungeon master. I think I can do it. My experience in Dungeons and Dragons began in 1987, I think. It's about 33 years ago. I was 10 years old and I was living in Papua New Guinea. My parents lived in Papua New Guinea, and so I lived in Papua New Guinea. They were teachers, and we had a very, very small community. And I had a friend named Ben who had the Monster Manual and the AD&D Second Edition Oriental Adventures book. So we played a lot of D&D for about 6 months before we realized that we weren't actually playing D&D. What we were doing was messing around with some character sheets and some dice and some monsters and drawing maps, and we didn't really understand how the concept worked because, as many of you will know, back in those days, back in the 1980s and earlier, because I was actually a latecomer, back in those days, there was no internet and there was no one to ask how to play Dungeons and Dragons. If you really wanted to know, I suppose you could write to TSR or to Dragon Magazine or whomever. But there was no really sort of clear depiction of it. You had to figure it out from the books and with your imagination. Imagine that. So one day we're sitting there and we've been playing for a while, messing around with our character sheets and rolling some dice and killing some Onis and assigning ourselves vast hoards of treasure and cheating like bastards because there was no dungeon master. So one day I said to Ben, I'm looking at these rules and I'm thinking, something funny about this. What could it be? So I said, what if I was to draw a map of a dungeon and you were to take your character and I was to describe to you what each room looked like, and you were to tell me what you did? And he was like, oh yeah, that's how you're supposed to play this game. I was like, well, why didn't you tell me that 6 months ago when we started this nonsense? He was like, oh, well, I didn't have the player's handbook, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, point being, we'd been messing around for a good 6 months before we actually started playing D&D. And that's how I figured it out. That was the first step. So a little bit after that, I moved to another town in Papua New Guinea where I discovered there was a bunch of Australians and New Zealanders and Americans and what have you. And we started playing D&D Second Edition. We played Dragonlance and a lot of other sort of homebrew stuff. We also played things like BattleTech and what else did we play? Palladium. Palladium was a big one. I played Palladium for years. I had a stack of Palladium books this high. And that was my big thing, actually, Palladium, for a very long time, which some of you probably know kind of through a roundabout route came as an offshoot from D&D originally. It was one of those groups of publishers, one of those publishers that D&D tried to, I think TSR tried to sue them at some point, and so they went off and did their own thing and changed a few bits and pieces and ended up with a role-playing game that was fairly successful. So Palladium was pretty cool, and then eventually, as I got a bit older, I ran into a game called Vampire the Masquerade from White Wolf Game Studios, and that actually became that was my game. That was the game that I played, because not only could you play it at a tabletop, rolling dice, doing all that stuff, Vampire the Masquerade was a game that you could play in a live setting where you had people dressing up in costume, playing their characters. There could be up to like 80 people at one event that would turn up in game, in character. And it was all politics and conversations and what have you. And you would get the occasional fight would break out, and people would use actually, paper, rock, scissors and stuff. There was a whole system of rules that used that. And the whole idea with that game is that you don't have to actually break character at any point. So there's all these hand signals. If you want to turn invisible because your character has obfuscate on your character sheet, which you had in your pocket as a little card. If you wanted to obfuscate, you just go like this, and everybody would know that you're invisible, so they would just not look at you. Or if you wanted to dominate someone, you could say, sit down, something like that. So that was Vampire the Masquerade, and I loved that game. And I ran the tabletop version of it, which works very much like D&D, same basic principle. Everyone's sitting around playing their characters, much more complicated character sheets. And in fact, one of the best game systems you could ever find. Very realistic in terms of how it works, the skill systems, the checks, and what have you. Awesome. So anyway, we played Vampire the Masquerade. I was the storyteller for Vampire the Masquerade for 12 years in one game we had ongoing different people, but there was 3 consistent people and about 5 other people that came and went through that whole period. But it was one story. It was one game that continued for 12 years, and it was very successful. We loved that game, and I was literally the forever DM. So, I've run a bunch of other games as well. I've run some games that I've made up. I've created games from scratch. We did a whole action-y spy thrillery game that one of my friends and I made up from scratch. And we created a bunch of tables and a whole system. Also played Recon. Recon is a really good system if you've never heard of it. Recon, what I like about Recon is it has like 3 stats. There's strength, intelligence, and dexterity. And you think about this, your strength is your hit points. Think about that. Strength is hit points. Makes perfect sense. And you'd have a percentile score, so you'd have like 100 hit points or 77 hit points. And as your hit points went down, so did your strength, because it's the same thing. Makes sense. So anyway, there's a bunch of games that we played. So yeah, now I want to talk about what I'm up to at the moment. Now, what I'm up to at the moment, basically, my current plans and goals, my current objectives for Dungeons & Dragons, I'm running a game called Sidariel, which is a campaign setting that I basically created myself. It's a homebrew, and Sidariel is high fantasy. This is the map here, as you can see. It's created in Vector, and it's based on a hand-drawn sketch that I did and what have you. And it has a bunch of factions and politics, and it's got elves and an orcish empire. In this particular case, there is an empire of orcs, but it is on the decline. And there's this huge rift that runs through it over here. You can kind of see that black line scars the landscape. That's the Parkard Rift, which was created by a meteorite, which was in fact a weapon launched by the one-eyed orc god, whose name I shall not mention, to take revenge upon the elves for, basically for his eye. It also happened to hit the moon and shatter it into a million pieces, leaving a whole bunch of these floating dungeons scattered above the sky like this sort of staircase above the heavens, which is part of the end game content of Sidariel, by the way. And once in a while, when you look up at the sky in Sidariel, you'll see, if you look really carefully and it's a good day and you're lucky, you might see a giant or a dragon jumping from one chunk of architecture to the next up in the sky. So that's a big part of it. Sidariel is also a kind of a flat Earth construct. So all of these continents and islands that you see are floating. They're floating on water, but the water is also floating on this kind of astral sea. So if you go far enough out in the water and you see these little dotted lines, the water gives way to the astral sea. It's kind of imperceptible. You kind of float off into the mist, and then it's quite possible that you might disappear and appear in some entirely different demiplane, because Sidariel is a demiplane. And it was basically, Sidariel is some leftover sort of material that was left over from one of the official Dungeons and Dragons universe worlds, named, starts with an F. Can you think of that one? So when that world was created, there was some leftover material, which one of the elven gods, the king of the elven gods, who also I shall leave unnamed, muted into this world with the assistance of some of the other gods and an ancient gold dragon who ended up getting banished to the Shadowfell, but that's in another story. So the main content of Sidariel, there's a couple of different ways to play this campaign if you want to play it with me, that is. And the first way is we play it as a campaign setting, and as you play through it, it's a sandbox. You can do anything you want. You can go anywhere you want. You can play anyone you want. To be fair, it's kind of elf-centric. Although there are some other races that are very strong and prominent too. But the humans are not as big a deal in Sidario as they might be in some of the more traditional campaign settings. Humans are in fact a little bit more rare. They do have some areas that are theirs, like over here, Moldrea there, and sort of up this kind of way, the city of Baingate. My hand's disappearing. But anyway, so yeah, they have got some very strong strongholds, but they don't so much have an empire as much as they have a bunch of city-states. It's more city-states, whereas the elves have an empire which is also in decline, much like the Orcan Empire is in decline. And I've taken some tropes from some other places, like there is a mountain range called the Banakaya, which separates the Orcan Empire from the Elven Empire, and there's really just one pass that allows you to get through, which has been closed for 1,000 years. So in the meantime, the problem, the sort of central tension that I'm trying to set up in Sidario is that the idea that time is speeding up since the moon was destroyed all these thousands of years ago, back in the time of the dragons and the giants when they were still at war. The moon was destroyed by the god of the orcs. And so with the moon gone, the balance of gravity and all of the various things that connect to the weave of the world have been, that the balance has been upset essentially. And so now the time itself is actually speeding up, and the world is starting to move faster and faster. Now this is very imperceptible right now at the moment in the game. No one would really notice this, although there are two suns, funnily enough. And so what's happening is as time's speeding up, some of the more powerful creatures in the genre in the world here beginning to notice these things and starting to think about, oh, this could be a problem. Now, the reason this is happening, not only because of the moon, but because the moon was connected to the goddess of the moon, who had a temple. The moon itself was, in fact, a temple, which is why when it's been smashed open, you've actually got a bunch of these dungeons in the sky that are sort of just hanging there. And so with the moon as her temple that's now smashed, her avatar was destroyed, and her soul was sent to the Nine Hells, where it's been trapped for squillions of years, which has caused quite a lot of heartache and pain on the part of the primal elves, in particular Corellon Larathian, who's basically having a big sulk and has gone off to Arvendor, and he's basically sulking over there. In the meantime, the Daughters of the Daughters of Twilight, the Order of the Daughters of Twilight, who are a bunch of Eladrin clerics and paladins, it's a matriarchal order, run from the Feywild primarily. That's where their main mother temple is. The Order of the Daughters of Twilight, they are kind of an interdimensional order of paladins and clerics who have access to some very powerful magic and what have you. And their objective, their raison d'etre, is in fact to restore the sacred and divine feminine to the world of Sidario. Now, I want to point out that, first of all, this is a matriarchal order. And so this is not some damsel in distress story. These are about women saving women, okay? If you will look further into it, you'll discover that the formulas behind this whole storyline are more complicated than that. And it's not as clear cut and straightforward as you might think. So, I've been doing this for a while, and I've been thinking about this for a while, and I'm pretty good at working with symbols and narratives and themes, and I think I know what I'm doing. All right, we might cut this video short for now and leave it there, but thank you for listening to my enormous rant about myself and Sidario and DMing. Be back shortly.